Kristi Noem defended the ICE agent involved in the Minneapolis shooting amid controversy over the incident. Joining us to discuss is Jason Johnson, president of Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund and former police executive. So Jason, good afternoon. What happened in Minneapolis yesterday, of course, is a tragedy, and our hearts go out to the families impacted by this. But the other side of the story is that it doesn't necessarily mean the law enforcement officer acted unjustly. So I have a clip here of Vice President J.D. Vance commenting on what happened yesterday. So just take a listen to this.
The simple fact is, what you see is what you get in this case. You have a woman who was trying to obstruct a legitimate law enforcement operation. Nobody debates that. You have a woman who aimed her car at a law enforcement officer and pressed on the accelerator. Nobody debates that. I can believe that her death is a tragedy, while also recognizing that it's a tragedy of her own making and a tragedy of the far left who has marshaled an entire movement, a lunatic fringe, against our law enforcement officers.
Jason, first off, your thoughts on what happened yesterday?
Well, I would echo your sentiments at the top. It's clearly a tragedy. There was a loss of life that was entirely unnecessary. The investigation is underway, and there does need to be an investigation. I get concerned from my perspective when anyone weighs in, particularly people in leadership positions, weigh in with decisive information, people calling this a murder and calling for the prosecution of the ICE agent, or just wholesale exonerating it. I think it needs to be investigated. The Supreme Court tells us that in order to review cases like this, the basic legal standard is in this case, ICE agents' conduct has to be objectively reasonable in the totality of the circumstances, which means, in plain English means that if a reasonable law enforcement officer in that officer's position would have made the same or similar decision, that's objectively reasonable. But we can only determine that after we know all the facts, not just on the basis of a few seconds of a video clip.
Okay, so exactly what are the rules of engagement when ICE agents operating, that they're operating under? What is the use of force protocols?
So ICE, the federal government certainly has policies regarding the use of deadly force, but generally in law enforcement officers are authorized to use deadly force if the circumstances exist in which there is a direct and imminent threat to the officer's life, whether it could be death or serious bodily injury, or to another person. So either the officer themselves or to another person. If the officer believes and reasonably believes that the result of what is getting ready to happen will be death or serious bodily injury. So, presumably in this case, the officer believed when he used deadly force that his life, either his life or serious bodily injury would be the likely result of being struck by the vehicle, and that using deadly force would help him to avoid that. And I say presumably because I imagine that's why I use deadly force. The legal question here for this investigation is not whether the officer themselves actually believe that, but whether that belief was objectively reasonable. Would a reasonable officer in that position feel the same way and feel moved to have to use deadly force? And, again, I know that a lot of people want to weigh in, particularly people in, leadership positions, elected leadership positions have weighed in. The governor, the city, the mayor, the city police chief, on both sides. And so, the president has weighed in, Secretary Noem, Vice President Vance. I understand that it's required that they say something about it. My concern is when what is said with great confidence what the outcome should be of the investigation, and we don't know what the outcome of the investigation is.
So you referenced the clip earlier. We all saw that. So could you give us an idea of exactly, for an officer in a situation like this, what might he consider, the list of things he must consider before choosing to fire his weapon?
It's important, I think, to remember that if you put yourself in the officer's position, it's not quite as simple as what it looks like in a few second video clip, because there were things that happened before. There is context, right? So ICE as an agency has been under really rhetorical assault and sometimes literal assault over the last number of months as a result of rhetoric coming from supposed leaders, demonizing ICE, causing people, regular, normal people, as it sounds that this individual who's involved in this incident was just a person who believed what she was told, that it was her duty as a citizen to obstruct ICE and to hinder them in any way possible. And she was probably just responding to that, thinking she was doing the right thing. So these agents have been exposed to this over many months. They've had objects thrown at them. They've been assaulted. They've been demonized in every possible way. So anyone would come to that incident with that thought that, hey, someone might want to kill me here in this particular case. And so it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of everything that has been happening. And the danger that exists when someone does try to obstruct your travel like that, that's legitimately a dangerous situation, especially in right here, what you're showing on the screen. We have a crowd, and I understand there was a crowd even before the incident. So in their mind, they are very defensive. They are feeling that they will be assaulted. So that's what's running through their mind. And so even though the movement of the car, I mean, everyone has seen the video, the movement of the car itself does not appear to be that threatening. The movement is not that fast. The officer is not, has the ability to step out of the path. But it's important to remember, we're not just looking at what actually happened in those few seconds. You have to think about what happened before and during and what's in the officer's mind and what would be in any reasonable officer's mind in that circumstance.
Okay, so you're right about the context, and specifically referring to that few-second clip, there's actually more before that, right? Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said yesterday the officer who fired the shots was actually dragged by a vehicle and injured during an operation in June. And I mean, I just want to make it clear here. Are you saying that potentially that as well influenced his decision in firing that shot yesterday?
I can't tell you specifically what influenced this agent's decision, but certainly if his personal experience had been that last time he was involved in a situation like this, he was actually dragged by a car. If that is true, certainly it's hard to imagine that didn't play into the decision-making here. As human beings, our experience does play into our decision-making. And so that's a plausible situation. Now, certainly I don't know anything about that prior situation, but I've heard about it. I don't know the underlying facts, but I do think it's relevant, as are other facts that led to this incident. And, I think the really important thing here is, an investigation is going to determine whether this was a lawful and proper shooting, right? What we do know, though, in addition to the fact that this is a tragedy, is that the cause of this, the underlying cause, is people in positions of authority demonizing ICE and essentially directing citizens to go out and obstruct them at every turn. And unfortunately, that's what this young mother did. It led to her demise. Had she not done that, she'd be with us today. And so, we'll resolve actually what happened as led up to the shooting, whether it was lawful and reasonable or not. But it doesn't change the fact that the reason it happened is all the dangerous rhetoric, and it really needs to stop.
Okay, so Jason, in cases where an officer uses lethal force and a life is lost, what do we know about the psychological impact this has on the officer involved? And what kind of support is provided to help them process and cope with that?
Yeah, and thank you for that question, because that's an important consideration here. Law enforcement officers are exposed to all sorts of human tragedy, no matter whether you're state, federal, or local. And when you're directly involved in a case like this, no matter how justified you feel in the moment to use deadly force, and no matter how justified you feel in the aftermath, it doesn't change the fact that you will carry the burden of having taken someone's life for the rest of your life. And so this is well documented, in the psychological community, that officers do need support. And many agencies, and I don't know exactly what ICE provides to their employees that are involved in critical incidents, but most contemporary law enforcement agencies provide considerable support to employees who are involved in difficult cases like this, just on a human level, that regardless of what the legal consequences might be, if there are any, the human toll on the individual and their family is truly significant.
Okay, Jason, just finally on the protests themselves, FBI Director Kash Patel told Just the News that they're investigating the organizers and funders of anti-immigration enforcement protests. And he said that these protests are impeding law enforcement activities and threatening public safety. So can we get your thoughts on whether you think these protests are organic, and when do they become a hindrance to law enforcement, these protests?
Many of the protests are not organic. They're organized and funded behind the scenes, and that's where, when people show up at protests, they've got all the signs that already are somewhat similar in appearance with slogans and things on them. Those are being provided and funded, by third parties. So, occasionally protests are organic. Most of the time around this issue of immigration and some of the other hot button issues today, they're not organic. They're well organized and they're well funded. In terms of impeding law enforcement, it's a sticky issue because on the one hand, in America, we have a right to protest as long as what we're doing is lawful. You certainly cannot hinder law enforcement, as we saw, which led up to this shooting. That is unlawful, no question about that. And that's a great example of what can't happen. It cannot happen, and law enforcement has to take action to stop it. It's dangerous and it's not lawful. However, peaceful protest is lawful, and it'll continue to be lawful as long as we're the United States. But there is a fine line between peaceful, lawful protest and unlawful conduct, as we saw that led up to the shooting. We have to be able to differentiate between the two when we use language, or people in leadership positions don't use language that makes clear what the difference is. Then sometimes innocent people, well-meaning people who just intend to protest, wind up getting swept into unlawful conduct that, as we see, can have really, truly tragic results.
Okay, Jason, very valuable insight today. Thank you so much for talking with us.
You're welcome.
The Justice Department will be creating a new position to investigate government fraud funding fraud. Here are the